Well, welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, September the 4th. My name is Pam, and let's begin with our first article. Americans ask, are protests a good reason to be openly armed? By Lisa Marie Payne from the Associated Press. In Boise, Idaho, the scenes have become commonplace in 2020. People gathered at state capitals with semi-automatic long guns strapped across their chests. A couple near St. Louis emerging from their mansion brandishing firearms as Black Lives Matter demonstrators marched by the house. Men roaming the streets with rifles during protests over racial inequality, punctuated by 2 people being killed in Wisconsin and another in Oregon over the weekend. The coronavirus pandemic, protests against racism and police killings, a rancorous election, and some people's perception that cities are being overrun by violent mobs have brought about a markedly more aggressive stance by some gun owners and widened the divide over firearms in the United States. Americans are turning out more often and more visibly with guns, a sign of the tension engulfing the country. Last week's arrest of a 17-year-old accused of killing 2 people in Kenosha, Wisconsin with a semi-automatic rifle is just the latest flashpoint. Over the weekend, supporters of President Donald Trump streamed into Portland, Oregon, resulting in a clash with protesters that ended with a supporter of a right-wing group fatally shot. The white teenager and other gun-toting protesters have been denounced as radical vigilantes who benefit from a double standard, that if they were black gun owners brandishing their firearms, the police would use deadly force against them. To others, they are patriots seeking to bring law and order to cities that have been overtaken by extremists. I would have done the same thing, to be honest with you, Todd Scott of Covington, Georgia, said of the teenager in Kenosha. He's viewed videos of the teen, Kyle Rittenhouse, being chased by protesters and believes he was acting in self-defense. Mr. Scott himself once used his gun to break up violence, becoming a bit of a local hero in 2015 after a gunman killed a clerk and a customer at the liquor store where he was picking up beer. Mr. Scott fired on the suspect before he fled. Kat Ellsworth, who heads the Liberal Gun Club chapter in Illinois and lives in Chicago, is appalled by those who have converged on protests and are openly carrying firearms. She believes those gun owners have been emboldened by Mr. Trump, who has made law and order a central part of his re-election bid. The scenes of primary white men openly carrying firearms on city streets, or of those who have flocked to state capitals to protest pandemic business restrictions, are a demonstration, she believes, of white privilege. She's convinced that a group of black gun owners with AR-15s in public would be dealt with much differently. I view them as instigators, and I view them as people looking for an excuse to shoot people of color, said Miss Ellsworth, who is white. The killings in Kenosha almost immediately opened a new front in the culture war over guns. Fox News' Tucker Carlson called the episode a result of authorities refusing to bring law and order to the city. How shocked are we that 17-year-olds with rifles decided they had to maintain order when no one else would, Mr. Carlson said. Around the same time last week, Mark and Patricia McCloskey, who were seen outside their St. Louis home in June brandishing a rifle and a handgun, were given a primetime slot at the Republican National Convention, where they defended their right to bear arms. In the first half of this year, the turmoil has fueled unprecedented buying of firearms. Every month so far has smashed last year's numbers of background checks. In a few instances, the number of background checks have soared past previous records set by a background check system that began in 1998. So far this year, nearly 23 million background checks have been conducted, though not all checks were for firearm purchases. Still, the gun industry estimates that 40% of firearm purchases have been made by first-time buyers, or about 5 million people. Ed Turner, a former police officer from Metro Atlanta, who now owns gun shops in Georgia, says he cringes seeing people openly carrying firearms. If someone is truly worried about their own safety, he said, concealing the weapon is a much better approach than walking around like John Wayne. Among the people flocking to his gun shops, he has seen mostly women, African Americans, and Latinos concerned about their personal safety and buying a firearm for the first time. He considers their concerns justified amid the calls to defund the police and protests that sometimes resulted in police stations being attacked. "I am stunned that that behavior is allowed to go on," he said. Gun control activists have viewed the situation in Kenosha, as well as the other protests that have drawn people openly carrying firearms, as a direct result of Mr. Trump's firebrand rhetoric. It is because of an extreme worldview that has been only encouraged at the highest levels of government and by the gun lobby that has condoned their presence there, said Nick Suplina, Managing Director of Law and Policy at Everytown for Gun Safety. The presence of armed militia at these protests are not there merely to protect property, but are there to intimidate protesters, to chill speech, and sometimes worse. Our next article is titled, "Why the Future of Elder Care May Be Fewer Nursing Homes" by Simon Montlake. When geriatrician Bill Thomas first sat down to reimagine American nursing homes, the risk of a deadly pandemic wasn't on his mind. His vision was of elder-directed care on a humane scale, an alternative to the big box homes staffed and run like hospitals. Nearly 2 decades on, the greenhouse movement he birthed has spread to 300 homes in 32 states, and when COVID-19 hit, its design features clusters of small buildings with private rooms and bathrooms helped to reduce the infections, even in hard-hit cities like Boston and Detroit. Dr. Thomas says these features provide a sense of belonging, which most nursing homes lack, and they lead to better health outcomes. If you fix the broken heart, it's also good for the body, and it's good for preventing infections, he said. For decades, reformers like Dr. Thomas have attempted to improve nursing homes. They have built alternative models, less institutional, smaller scale, better staffed, that appear to have done better during the pandemic. But the greater prize is to help more elders age in their homes and communities. As COVID-19 roils the nursing home industry and the federal spending behind it, that goal may be in reach, reformers say. Most people would prefer to age in place at home if at all possible. The COVID epidemic might strengthen that as people feel safer at home, says Ann Montgomery, co-director of Elder Care Improvement at Altarum Institute, a nonprofit health consultancy. The vast majority of Americans aged 65 and older currently live at home. But seniors who require support services often end up in nursing homes because they rely on Medicaid to pay for long-term care. In recent years, alternatives to institutional care have expanded in many states using Medicaid waivers. More than half of Medicaid dollars are spent on home and community-based services today. Now, COVID-19 has shined a spotlight on the often obscured lives of around 1.5 million Americans, with more than a third of deaths coming in nursing homes. The pandemic has upended the finances and reputations of home operators. It has disrupted the profitable flow of new residents discharged from hospitals. And it has forced the industry more generally to defend its poor record on infection control and other measures of quality and safety. The compact that people have made is to trade away certain freedoms and autonomy, and even respect and dignity, in return for a promise of security and safety. The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed that they, the nursing homes, have not been able to fulfill that, says Kevin Peterson, a Seattle-based advocate and co-founder with Dr. Thomas of Changing Aging. Nursing homes have pushed back against critics, pointing to the rapid spread of COVID-19 in urban areas where hard-hit homes were located. They also say public health officials failed to provide needed equipment and guidance. Regardless, the challenges they face are significant. Nursing homes have been set up to fail. They have extremely vulnerable populations, says Michael Barnett, assistant professor of health policy and management at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. They have workers who are underpaid and are largely immigrants and minorities who live in communities that are the worst affected. A new vision. Alternatives to traditional nursing homes vary from $4,000 a month private assisted living facilities to public funded adult day centers to at-home visits by carers. PACE Centers, which already provides a wide array of services to the elderly and disabled in 31 states, are another path to expanding non-institutional care options. A major impediment to independent senior living is cost. Not everyone is going to be able to afford to pay people for basic assistance to age in place and stay at home, says Ms. Montgomery of the Alteram Institute. One modest solution is a new federal program, Community Care Corps. It recently awarded $2.4 million in grants to 23 nonprofits nationwide. The nonprofits will deploy volunteers to support family caregivers, seniors, and people with disabilities living independently. Alteram Institute is helping to evaluate its effectiveness. This is the age of volunteerism. We need more volunteers, says Ms. Montgomery, also a former policy advisor to the Senate Special Committee on Aging. For his part, Dr. Thomas wants to reimagine what that home looks like. Only 10% of U.S. housing is considered age-friendly. His vision is a home that is age-friendly, affordable, and woven into a community of all ages so that elders can sustain the connections that he sees as essential to longevity. He's designed a small modular house he calls a Minka that can be added to existing properties or built in clusters to create new communities. The houses can be as small as 330 square feet, but are designed for the elderly and their needs. Affordable housing can also be set aside for young renters who can help seniors with daily tasks. In the Netherlands, city planners have added housing for students in buildings and courtyards with seniors, as well as making it easier for families to build add-ons for the elderly. Dr. Thomas hopes such innovations can spur a generational shift in the U.S. away from nursing homes as inevitable. That shift is already underway as home and community care grows more popular and policymakers grapple with the costs of long-term care. What COVID-19 has done, he said, is to change the velocity. Instead of hoping to make something happen in 10 years, we're trying to make it happen in 10 months. Dean Peterson, age 91, has spent the pandemic in her Appalachian co-housing community in Abington, Virginia, which has around 40 seniors. Her Elder Spirit community formed a task force that set down some ground rules: social distancing, no house visits, masks required outside. As a result, she says, we've had no contamination here at all. While Ms. Peterson misses aqua aerobics classes at the local pool, she has learned to socialize with her neighbors via Zoom. The app was introduced by the young people, the 60-year-olds. The former nun founded Elder Spirit in 2006 as a way to age in place together, and her mixed income, multi-faith community for ages 55 and up thrives on mutual support. One of the best things is the fact that we manage ourselves, she said. We've set up so that everybody has a chance to be useful. Those with heightened medical needs can choose to move to assisted living or arrange family caregivers or home health care in the comfort of their residence. Ms. Peterson plans on the latter. It's one of the best ways of growing old that I know, she said. You're not lonely. How about doing the math? Even the most ardent critics of big box homes accept the need for nursing homes in an aging society. Over the last decade, the number of 65 and older Americans have grown by a third to 54 million, according to Census Bureau data. Home-based care is harder to regulate than nursing facilities, and providers face similar challenges in recruiting low-paid carers. In tough economic times, families also find it harder to care for their elders. Caregivers already face the burden of lost earnings and reduced pensions. While Medicaid pays for traditional nursing care as a safety net, eligibility for home and community services vary by state. Nursing home operators have long complained that reimbursements from Medicaid averaging $200 a day are too low to pay for the skilled nursing that residents need. Many homes use Medicare payments for post-acute short-term care to cross-subsidize their long-term beds. This funding structure is one reason why few nursing homes were being built, even before COVID-19, relative to the growing elderly population. In 2003, Steve McAlally built the first greenhouse nursing home in Tupelo, Mississippi. The organization he leads, Methodist Senior Services, now has 19 homes statewide. All are built to Dr. Thomas's design of small buildings with individual rooms staffed by nurse aides who also cook and clean and are known as Shabas, denoting a higher status than normal aides. Dr. Thomas is no longer formally involved with the Greenhouse Project, which is based in Linthicum, Maryland. Mr. McAllily's nonprofit also operates a traditional 60-bed nursing home. When COVID-19 began spreading in local nursing homes last month, he took all precautions to protect his residents. In the 60-bed home, 26 residents tested positive and 3 died. And 20 staff were also sickened, he said. By contrast, only one greenhouse had a small outbreak and nobody died. The same management, the same culture. The only difference is the design, he says. Susan Ryan, Senior Director of the Greenhouse Project, says only 6 residents in 245 homes surveyed nationwide have died of COVID-19. Facility layouts was one of the factors. Another was staffing. The Shabazz model means residents don't see a cadre of nurses, aides, and other workers. The direct care staff that is providing care to the elders are also doing the cooking and cleaning, and that means there are fewer people coming in to do those activities, she says. Key moments. Greenhouses cost more to build, and most are run by nonprofits, while the rest of the nursing industry mostly follows a model that is more like a hospital than a home. But a for-profit operator in Arkansas has begun to build more greenhouses rather than expand other types of care homes, says Mr. McAllily. The pandemic has made families rethink traditional nursing facilities. The developer believes this is the future, he says. Developers tend to build large nursing homes because scale is seen as necessary in an industry that relies on federal reimbursements that operators say hasn't kept pace with the costs. Those costs have risen during the pandemic, while income from both long-term residents and short-term Medicare-funded stays has declined. Still, some advocates say the root of the problem exposed by the pandemic is not money or policy, but social attitudes. In an age-stratified society, caring for the old isn't a common goal, but a headache to solve. So vulnerable elders are sent to homes staffed by low-paid carers. In polls, around half of Americans over 40 say that almost everyone is likely to need long-term care, but only 25% believe this applies to them. Advocates say this mismatch helps explain why policymakers have been slow to reform the nursing home sector. We have ageism and we have racism, and that has had a tremendous impact on what we're seeing. As a society, we have accepted what some call warehousing. We have almost dehumanized elders. They have been the other, says Ms. Ryan of the Greenhouse Project. She adds, if we don't take this pandemic and learn from it, shame on us. Staff writer Sarah Matusik also contributed to the reporting of this article. Our next article, migrants trying to reach Europe squeezed by pandemic and the sea. Spain has successfully halved the number of migrants arriving at its shores, but landings in the Canary Islands have increased by 550% this year. Most migrants are not prepared to undertake the perilous journey. By Renata Brito, Associated Press. Fuerteventura, Spain. Migrants are increasingly crossing a treacherous part of the Atlantic Ocean to reach the Canary Islands, a Spanish archipelago near West Africa, in what has become one of the most dangerous routes to European territory. About 4,000 people have survived the perilous journey this year. More than 250 others have died or gone missing, according to the International Organization for Migration. That's already more than the number of people who perished trying to cross the Western Mediterranean in all of last year. In the week that the Associated Press spent in the Canary Islands to report this story, at least 20 bodies were recovered. The increase in traffic to the Canaries come after the European Union funded Morocco in 2019 to stop migrants from reaching southern Spain via the Mediterranean Sea. While arrivals to mainland Spain decreased by 50% compared to the same period last year, landings in the Canary Island have increased by 550%. In August alone, there were more than 850 arrivals by sea to the Canaries, according to an AP tally of numbers released by Spain's Interior Ministry and reports by local media and NGOs. Hawa Diabate was fleeing her native Ivory Coast by boat with her 2-year-old daughter, Noura, to what she believed was continental Europe. The only person who wasn't crying on the boat was Noura. Unlike the 60 adults on board, only Noura was oblivious to the risks of crossing the open waters of the Atlantic Ocean in an overcrowded rubber dinghy. As the waves quickly got bigger and people more nervous, Noura told her mother, "Be quiet, Mama. Boza, Mama. Boza." Miss Diabate recalled. The expression is used by sub-Saharan migrants to celebrate a successful crossing. After several hours in the ocean, it was finally Boza. Spain's Maritime Rescue Service brought them to safety on one of the Canary Islands. Arrivals this year are still low compared to the 30,000 migrants who reached the island in 2006, but they are at their highest in over a decade since Spain stemmed the flow of sea arrivals to just a few hundred a year through deals with West African countries. The striking shift in migration back to the Canaries has raised alarms at the highest level of the Spanish government. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez's first trip abroad following the pandemic lockdown was to Mauritania, one of the main departure points. Most recently, the Interior Ministry announced a donation of 1.5 million euros in border surveillance equipment to 6 West African countries. But human rights organizations say those arriving to Spanish shores are only a fraction of those departing. "We're only seeing the tip of the iceberg," said Sophie Mueller, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees representative in Spain, who recently visited the archipelago. They are taking impossible routes. It can take 1 to 10 days to reach the Spanish islands, with the closest departure point being in Tafaya, Morocco, 62 miles, and the furthest recorded this year in Barra, the Gambia, more than 1,000 miles. It is common for migrants to run out of food, water, and fuel after only a few days. On August 19, 15 lifeless Malayans were spotted inside a wooden boat by a Spanish plane 92 miles from the island of Gran Canaria and towed back to port. At nightfall, workers pulled the bloated corpses one by one out of the boat with a crane. The next day, police collected what was left behind as evidence: a wallet, a dozen cell phones, windbreakers, and waterproof boots. Less than 24 hours later, another migrant boat was rescued and brought to the island with 12 people and 4 dead as the AP watched. The survivors had witnessed their comrades die along the way. "They almost didn't speak," said Jose Antonio Rodriguez, who heads the Regional Red Cross Immediate Response Team. "They were in a state of shock. One of the 12 rescued died before he could reach a hospital." Human rights organizations aren't just concerned with the high number of deaths. There's been a change in profile, said Ms. Mueller, the UNHCR representative in Spain. "We've seen more arrivals from the Sahel, from the Ivory Coast, more women, more children, more profiles that would be in need of international protection." The Interior Ministry of Spain denied requests by the Associated Press to share nationalities of recent arrivals to the Canary Islands, claiming the information could impact international relations with the countries of origin. But UNHCR estimates that around 35% of those arriving by boat came from Mali, the nation at war with Islamic extremists, where a coup d'etat recently toppled President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. Around 20% of arrivals are women, and 12% are under 18, Ms. Muller said. Kassim Diallo fled Mali after his father was killed in an extremist attack targeting an army base near his village in Sokolo in late January. On February 29th, the 21-year-old got aboard a rubber boat in Léonie in the Western Sahara with 35 other men, women, and children. After nearly 20 hours in the water, his group was rescued and brought to the island of Fuerteventura. It's not normal. A human being shouldn't do this, but how else can we do it? Said Mr. Diallo. Like most of those who crossed by boat to the archipelago this year, Mr. Diallo has been stuck on the island for months. Although forced return flights to Mauritania have been halted by the pandemic, the Spanish government has also forbidden newly arrived immigrants from going to the mainland, even after travel restrictions were lifted for nationals and tourists. Only a few groups, mainly women and children, have been transferred on an ad hoc basis via the Red Cross. Blocking people from leaving the Canaries has turned the island into an open-air prison, said Texma Santana, who represents the local office of the Spanish Commission to Help Refugees. This story was reported by the Associated Press, and this story was funded in part by the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. Well, my friends, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, September 4th. My name is Pam, who will be turning 65 this month, saying, please stay in if you can, stay safe, you be blessed, and do what you can to make today a great day.